Well, hello everybody. Welcome to episode 78 of the Telemedia podcast with myself, Jarvis Todd, and up there my old mate Paul Skeldon, who's the editor-in-chief of Telemedia News, Telemedia Magazine, and all things telemedia that we put out across all of our dedicated media channels. We're going to spend. Hi, Paul.
Hello, mate.
We're
Nice
going to
to see
spend
you again. I
the
think it's episode 79.
Oh, it's 79. Okay. We're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so covering a couple of the most interesting topics that have come across our news desk this week. And as many of you will know, we are fresh from another magnificent show, World Telemedia event in Marbella. And one of the hot topics there was, in fact, that the UK market is open for business because there's been some radical changes in the regulatory environment, and that is something that we're going to be covering. And we're going to look at what the sort of impact on the sort of or the topic in general and how that affects the wider DCB environment. And then at the end of that, we're going to obviously focus on the impact of AI on payments. And It seems like we can never get away from that now. So we're going to cover that in the second part. So firstly, Paul, let's talk about healthy DCB and look at the UK specifically as an example. And for anyone that doesn't know, the UK market has developed a reputation for being a little bit complex in that back in the old days, it was one of the first kind of big markets, and with that came an awful lot of problems, an awful lot of customer complaints, and numerous incarnations of a dedicated regulator. That also led to numerous rewritings of various codes of conduct, which made it a very difficult kind of moving target for anybody that was operating in the UK market. One minute you were compliant, the next minute you weren't, and it developed a reputation for being a little bit awkward. Over the last couple of years, as things have simmered down, calmed down, the complaint levels have reduced, and all of this is now under the watchful eye of the main comms regulator, Ofcom. So the UK market, the message that came out of Marbella was the UK market is very much open for business, and Paul had the joy of spending some time with Joe Cox, who runs the industry association there in the UK. Tell us a little bit about what Joe had to say to you in Marbella, Paul.
Yeah, well, Joe was there representing AIM to sort of basically explain how the UK's regulatory market has changed. As you say, Ofcom is now in charge. Just to backtrack, as you said, it was an extremely complicated regulatory setup in the UK. It was very reactive. It was quite punitive. There were, troublesome services. It led to a lot of complaints. Things got shut down. The regulations kept changing literally every year. So you get one set of regulations, and while you were working to meet them, you knew they were writing the next set for next year, which would be different. So it's been a mess for a long time, probably the best part of 20 years. It's quite extraordinary. However, complaints have fallen. The services have become much more mainstream and well respected. And complaints have fallen to the extent that it's sort of deemed by government that it doesn't need a separate regulator. So it's been folded into Ofcom, which regulates everything from the sort of postal service right the way through to the sort of broadband, fiber optic cables that come into your home, to advertising, to TV, everything. It's now part of that. What's interesting is that they've created a new set of regulations for these services, but it's been done through an act of parliament. So it's set in stone that these are the regulations. This is what you have to meet and do to operate in the UK. And what it's meant is that you have to do a lot of work up front if you want to start a service, but once it's done, it's done. And you can be fairly sure that it's not going to change. And that suddenly makes the UK market much more attractive because you can make the investment in trying to run services here. I mean, it's a competitive market. It's a very developed market, but it's worth the investment because if you've got a good idea for a service, it's going to continue to run. It's not going to be great for the next 6 months and then suddenly it's all going to change. You're going to have to rethink it. So that was the sort of main thrust of what's happened. And this is what Joanna at AIM said to me about what those sort of changes sort of mean in practice for people and why it's an opportunity.
Probably the most key thing is the fact that this document won't change. So under the PSA, the codes of practice, I think we got up to the, I don't know, 15th, 16th,
I think it was
7th,
16th,
I don't even
maybe
know.
even 17.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and one would come out and they'd already be writing the next one, and so the regulatory landscape just shifted constantly, and it was hard for people who are interested in the UK to know where they stood. What Ofcom have done is they've put in place a statutory instrument, and what that means is it's a legal document. It's gone through Parliament, so it cannot be changed. So that means we've got a stable regulatory environment for the first time in, well, ever in this
indeed,
industry.
yeah.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Ofcom seem to be more of a hands-off regulator, but they are asking people to front-load sort of a regulatory piece of work before they join the market. And when they register with Ofcom, which they must do 5 days before they go live, that's sort of saying, yes, I've done that piece of work. So there's a big piece on risk management. There's a big piece on having a generally authorised person who Ofcom can go to if they've got any concerns. So it is, it's a bit of a chunk up front. But then once that chunk's done and you're registered, then it's just a case of sort of reviewing those processes and just updating them as you need to. So, a little bit of hard work, but then potentially a smoother ride after that.
Okay, so as Joe sort of points out, like she covers there sort of the key things that have changed with how the UK is regulated, and it is a big shift in how that's moved. But what it means is that we finally have a very stable market in the UK, which makes it a big opportunity. As I said before, we played the clip. It makes it worth the investment. It makes it worth people coming here to the UK. That's where we're podcasting from, and looking at the investment that's needed to run these services, and the return will be really good. I think the other upshot of this is that it sort of makes it again a more appealing environment for network operators to work in the sort of telemedia space. It makes it, reinforces that sort of stability. It reinforces the fact that they're not going to get sort of a ton of complaints and a ton of problems, and it just won't be worth the effort, which I think is probably an even bigger boost for it in that they're going to look at it as a much more sort of effective market and something they want and should be involved in.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think the one of the interesting things about regulation and a regulator that is very pro-business, which of course AIM is if you can get into a market where you've got a very supportive pro-business regulator that's worked tirelessly to bring all of the parties together to create a market that is and does have some stability and that can offer any new entrants a sort of assurances that if they play by the rules, then the benefits, the financial benefits, are there to be had. And I suppose, as a business, the telemedia industry and specifically what we're going to do at Telemedia going forward in 2026 is to try to incubate even more of that kind of collaboration. And I know that our head of strategy, Ansel Robertson, is going to be working very hard next year to ensure that we have our clients and the stakeholders have much better access to regulators and get them into the same room, because it's quite interesting. Obviously we're talking about new markets and how the industry is becoming truly global, but of course some of those new markets will have consumers that are not used to services and networks that are not used to running those services. And of course, you can immediately, with the benefit of the experience that we've got and that established players have got in working with regulators or getting regulators and MNOs together to create or avoid some of those kind of obvious pitfalls that people might sort of perceive in new spaces. And so I think this kind of message is really important for the industry on a sort of global scale as it looks to expand and as I say, move into developing markets, and also to protect markets that are now starting to look really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think yes, even though the UK is an extremely developed market, lessons can be learned from how we here have approached this regulatory setup. And as you say, it is something that all those developing markets can also sort of look at and take the bits of it that will work for them and have their own bits. And there's lessons that we can also learn, I think, from these other markets. And that was sort of the thrust of a webinar that MCP Insight put on the other week that Ansel Robertson, our head of strategy, took part in. And it was very much aimed at the idea of how to create the sort of a good DCB environment, essentially. So how the services, the operators, the billing can all work together in a sort of coherent way to offer a really good service to consumers. And the sort of main starting point of this was looking at developing markets. And as you say, a lot of these services are new to consumers in those markets. They're not sure what they're about, what they're doing. I think it's in those sort of circumstances, it's easy to think, oh, whoa, this looks like a problem. I want my money back. And, it does lead to a whole load of complaints. And as Ansel and David Ashman from MCP and Insight both sort of said in this webinar, is that really what you've got to try and do is set up a regulatory environment that's not sort of reacting to those complaints, but is sort of primed, ready for that new market sort of hiccups and things about how you sort of get that going. And as you say, the regulator needs to be embedded in the value chain. They need to be, part of that. The network operators have to be, the regulators do, and the service providers. And we really need to bring all those things together. Because the regulation is a vital part now of the value chain in all markets, and it's key. And as Ansel said in the webinar, really the only way you can do this is through like proper collaboration, and that is it to some degree is easier said than done. So this is what she had to say on the webinar.
What it really is the correct people need to start by being in the same room. Now, it might be very difficult to get the various competing MNOs in the same market, the government mandated regulator, the main gateways, key CPs, everyone in the same. It might be difficult, but it's possible. You need a neutral, obviously, party to facilitate that, and you need a clear agenda with a clear outcome. But once you have that, that's where it starts. That's always where it's going to start, is by getting the right people in the same room and defining a sort of shared goal. And that goal then inevitably needing to be this balance between consumer protection and market stimulation. Now, once you have that, once you have sort of on paper, at least everyone's buy-in, and you have the shared vision defined, then you 100% need to be transparent. This is not the platform or the climate in which we're going to be like, oh, you're my competitor or what, so we're not going to. No, within reason, there needs to be transparency, and there needs to be sort of clarity on what we're agreeing to here, what stakeholders are agreeing to, and even more so as the market then develops into what hopefully is this sort of sustainable market environment. That transparency needs to underpin everything else going forward. Because
okay, so that was Ansel really very succinctly put sort of certainly the first two stages of what's needed to sort of create this kind of sort of favourable DCB environment around regulation through collaboration, and of course the transparency to show what they're all doing. The webinar went on to say a whole load of stuff about the sort of practicalities of that, which is, you should, everyone hopefully will download and listen to the webinar after this, and we don't really have time to sort of go through the whole thing, but essentially the collaboration is great and essential, but then you've got to make sure that there's standardization within that, so that what all the network operators are offering is very similar or the same. So consumers see like common flows, and they know what they're going to get, and what they're looking at is familiar the more they use it, regardless of where they're doing the service. And that's quite difficult to do, I think, is to align, particularly from the operator side. They've got to work together, even though they're competitors. And that, in any market is essential, but is often the key to making these things work. It was brought up at World Telemedia by Lily from Lily Mobile about like she's trying to make this happen in the Greek market. And the only way to move forward and develop the market is to get competing companies to talk to each other and approach the MNOs as one. And that's easier said than done. Uh, Equally, the next phase of all of that is then, because it is a competitive market, they have to differentiate what they do. And so on paper, this is a sort of easy, obvious process. You collaborate, you standardize, and then you can all make money. Practicality, it is quite difficult. And, it's something I think we can look at how WASPA in South Africa, which is sort of an organization that promotes sort of self-regulation in the South African market, it's managed to sort of do a lot of this and actually make it happen. And the South African market, as we all know, is quite strong as a result. I think building on what we were saying earlier about the UK's regulatory changes, it'll be interesting to see whether a similar sort of process emerges in the UK as well, and what lessons can be taken from that. Even if it doesn't work so well in the UK, you can learn from what necessarily didn't work. So I think, this is an interesting time for DCB, and I think regulation, as I said, holds the key to making this something that works, but it's not going to necessarily be straightforward. But interesting to see where this goes.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the things that seems to be a common theme, and it's important to not focus on the negatives, but whether you're talking about generating traffic or launching services into certain markets, the conversation is invariably around a problem to solve, where at all levels, and I think
Yeah.
what's really interesting about the telemedia industry is that those problems are kind of hardwired into the ability to successfully drive profitable services into new markets, and the prize is there, and you can't expect to have a profitable service unless you jump over some hurdles. And I
Mm.
felt like it's really, as I say, it's kind of hardwired into the industry that they expect firstly to just solve the problem, or navigate, the landscape. And a couple of things came up with Joe. Yes, it will involve some time and some planning at the front end in order to get into the UK market. And that's just part of the deal. But you wouldn't you wouldn't do it unless it was it was worth
Mm.
doing. It's just part of the business, and solving those problems is part. And I felt that the established players in our market, they just get that. They just know.
Mm.
It's like, well, and it's really interesting to see. We're continually hearing about new markets being opened up, new innovative services, and those things would not happen unless a bunch of people were working together to
Yeah.
overcome the obstacles and work out the regulatory frameworks and work out the laws and the rules and the regs, and equally, the challenges of driving traffic, and where it comes from, and engaging customers. They're all kind of, it's all part of the deal, but the prizes are obviously there. Otherwise, nobody would be doing it. We wouldn't be seeing the
Mm.
telemedia industry going from strength to strength. Not least when there was discussions about, of course, the this was mentioned in Dubai, and it was also mentioned in Marbella, about how you may end up having to be investing for 3, 4, 5 months before you
Mm.
even start seeing a penny coming back. And of course, 20 years ago, I mean, that would have mind-boggling. Nobody would have bothered. But now, these things are kind of part of the DNA of the industry. And I think that, because companies have to invest, whether it's time, resources, advertising spend, and have to wait to get the money back, that just makes for more committed players, more robust strategies, and ultimately, I think that's one of the reasons why we're going back to the top of the vodcast. In so many markets, we're seeing complaint levels go down because,
Yeah.
ultimately, good companies are providing good services in the right markets and in the right way. And of course, that's what we want to see right the way across the world. And where, as we've talked about a lot, where we can learn from those experiences, and particularly as we move into new markets, being able to again, just to sort of conclude, that collaboration and that idea of getting the right people in the right room sounds so simple.
Mm.
But that's what World Telemedia
Yeah.
as a business is kind of set up to do. And I think that, looking forward to 2026, that's going to be a much stronger theme for our live events as we start to move into territories where there are emerging market opportunities and where we feel like we can play a really sort of active part in helping
Mm.
open up those markets and helping the stakeholders get it right first time. So I think that, from that point of view, and particularly with having Ansel on board, it's great to see her invited into that webinar. That puts us in a better position to provide even more practical services to the industry going forward, certainly from a sort of strategic, global point of view. So, I'm buzzing for 2026, Paul.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's all the pieces are falling into place with this the sort of regulatory environment, the discussion around regulation and DCB. It's exciting and it is happening. And I think you made a really like good point that it's past that sort of critical point of it works well enough that big companies are prepared to invest in making this happen, which just forces complaints down and down and down, and it just becomes then a much more uh, sort of lubricated market that just
Yeah.
works so much better. And that in turn will bring in more MNO investment and time because they'll see this as their ability to offer streaming services and entertainment and become those kind of companies. Rather than thinking, well, yeah, we'll do some DCB, we'll make a bit of money out of it, but it's a bit of a pain in the arse, really.
Mm, mm. Well,
That's
let's
that's all almost gone, I think, now as an attitude.
yeah, I agree. Well, I'm glad you mentioned DCB because, of course, as we've mentioned many times, DCB ultimately has driven and underpinned our industry for quite a long time. Although, as we now know, and have been focusing on over the last sort of couple of years, alternative payment mechanisms are very much coming into the telemedia industry and into the sort of telemedia value chain. It's not, it's not the only billing mechanism in town, although it's one that we know and love, and it has its own benefits. But we have to, and merchants are, very aware of trying to offer the full range of payment mechanisms in order to maximize those conversion rates. And almost on a weekly basis, there seems to be some new mechanism. But there has been a lot of talk recently around this whole kind of A to P thing, and obviously the impact of AI. And the second story reads, "An eye on the next wave of payments embedded in AI discovery."
Mm.
So why don't you talk us through? I mean, I have to admit, we're starting to get technical. It's all baffling. It's all baffling. And from my point of view, it's just, does it work? But I think you probably got a slightly better handle on it than I have, Paul.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason I sort of put this in is because we've spent most of the podcast talking about kind of the improving the DCB environment, which is, the here and now and very important. It's going to underpin sort of this market for some time to come. It's interesting, however, that ChatGPT has built in embedded payments into how it works, this instant checkout idea. So currently it's something that's aimed at the sort of like the e-commerce retail sector, but bear with me because it is relevant, I think, because their plan is that increasingly shoppers are sort of going, find me what are the best running shoes for under $100, that help my sort of bunions. And Chat GPT will suggest all sorts of things and give you links to go and sort of see them and all the rest of it. Now with this instant checkout, you can do that and effectively buy it there and then through Chat GPT. So Chat GPT is doing what Google did years ago, making itself shoppable, handling the sort of transaction to some degree, and making a small percentage. It will change online shopping, I suspect, quite dramatically in the next 5 years. For the telemedia sector, it does also, I think, have resonance because you are going to find people young people will ask ChatGPT or similar, like, what's the best sort of streamed football content around sort of what's happening in the dressing room at the Champions League matches that happened last night, and it will find them, and it will also then with this instant checkout idea, you'll be able to just click it and buy it and pay for it through account to account payment via ChatGPT, which changes how people find the content, how they pay for it. And that's significant. It's not going to happen in 2026, but it will at some point, I think, be how this works. And we did talk about this a bit in our last podcast, sort of straight off the back of Marbella, that a lot of the talk is about Google traffic being generated through Google and banner ads from Google. And that's all fine. And that's a massive way of doing it. And it'll stay like that despite cost pressures and all the rest of it. But AI discovery is increasingly becoming the way people find stuff. And we're all finding ourselves probably finding things through Google that's using Gemini, it's AI, rather than the search results. I know I do. I tend to read those first. Make those shoppable, and bingo, you've got a whole different sort of discovery mechanism, which changes how you market your services, how you list them online, what payment types you need to take, and how that works. And it can work with DCB and account to account payment, as long as it's seamless and easy for the consumer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I actually think that we might be talking about this a little sooner, or I think you might see the impact on this a little sooner. I mean, one of the things we've noticed over the last, I suppose, since COVID, but within the sort of remit of what we talk about, obviously we know as we mentioned earlier, that payments kind of has underpinned the industry, but content is now an unbelievably important part of that. But the third thing, which you just can't ignore, is obviously the advertising side of things, and that's becoming bigger and bigger and more of a topic of conversation within the pages of our news. The content of our conference, as you know, the fact that Google had become a sort of regular at the show was pleasing. But I mean, now we look at it and it's sort of it's almost a given. But as we saw in Marbella, there are a lot. They're not the only show in town. I mean, and the way that people find things is an essential part of that. That conundrum that we talked about earlier, in terms of it's all very well having the content and having the payment mechanisms, but you've still got to get those to consumers. And so advertising and search and anything connected with that, I think is essential. And I would be, I'm absolutely certain that the sort of the marketing arm of the telemedia sector, and the advertisers and the merchants and all the clever people, the agencies, all the clever people at that end of the value chain are going to be looking very, 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 very closely at any developments of this sort. And I would imagine that it's going to be a hot topic of conversation in Barcelona, which is our next event. The next time that we can get the right people in the same room. And Barcelona, for anyone that doesn't know, is the 1st and 2nd of March. I can also reveal that after that, if that's not enough, we're going to be heading over and lending our support to development of all the wonderful things that are going on in the MENA region with Telemedia Dubai, which is on the 26th to the 28th of April, same time, same place. Well, no, actually a little bit earlier, so it won't be quite so hot. And that's going to be at the wonderful Marriott on the Palm. And then, of course, we will be going back to the spiritual home of telemedia, and that is Marbella, and that will be the 4th to the 6th of October. So that, again, same time, same place. So please do make a note in your diary of all of those events. If you want to find out, if you want to see the whole range of services that we offer, the media and events, you just need to go to world-telemedia.com, which is our new URL, where everything will be sitting under one lovely, easy to understand umbrella. Paul, I think we're pretty much done for the day. Thanks very much for your time. Really interesting. Great to get some follow up from what was an excellent show in Marbella. Great to have a little look at the future, which is of course AI, and we will do it all over again in 2 weeks' time. So until then, I will see you later. Have a good one, mate.